Linda Greer, is a returning guest to this lovely pod. Linda, for 20 years or so, worked at the NRDC, and now is doing a range of things, including maybe you need to say, are you a fellow?
I'm a global fellow for the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs, which is a Chinese environmental NGO.
Okay, a global fellow. I bet you can't beat that, Phil.
No, I can't.
Well, it's called global because I'm actually not living in China, so it's sort of for not
so
such
anyone
yes.
outside of China
Yes.
is global. Okay. And Phil, you are my global fellow, but what exactly? Phil, of course, I've known for a very long time as well. Spent 10 years at Marks and Spencer's before starting his own expert consultancy called Color Connections.
Yep.
Yeah, you've been doing that for how long now?
11 years.
11 years. Okay. So let's start out like this. I just want you to answer true, false, or not sure to these statements, so we get a sense. So the apparel and textile industry uses a significant amount of harmful chemicals.
True.
True.
The seriousness of the problem is, however, overblown.
False.
Some of that's true, some of that's overblown.
Chemical companies are part of the problem.
True.
True.
Wow. Watchdog organizations like Greenpeace are crucial for accelerating improvements.
True.
True, provided they...
You don't get to say provided, you get to say
Somewhere between true and
Okay. There have been significant improvements to address these challenges in chemical management during the last 25 years.
True.
True.
There are good solutions today.
True.
Wow, that was better than I thought. All right.
True to...
Good. So let's start out by giving just a 10-minute introduction to this area for those who are new to it. Can you both, from your own perspectives, just remind us when and how chemicals are used in apparel and textiles in our industry? Just the basics.
Okay, I'll kick off. They're used from start to finish. So they are used in agriculture for growing fibres, they're used in the chemical industry for making synthetic fibres, they are used as processing aids in weaving, in knitting, in spinning, they are used in large quantities in wet processing, and they are used by the consumer to do home laundry. However, where they are used and where they come off the textiles and go to the environment are different. So they're used throughout the chain, but the main areas in wet processing where they are removed and go down the drain. So that is the key area to
wet processing, you mean when the fabrics
where
dyed?
the fibres, yarns, fabrics are scoured, bleached, dyed, where chemical finishes are applied to give a particular performance parameter.
Okay. So how harmful are the chemicals that are used, though? You know?
There's no single measure of harmfulness. So there are a basket of parameters. So you've got carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, tetragenicity. You've got endocrine. Well, these are things where they can affect your cells and cause them to mutate or change. There's endocrine disruptors. There's toxicity. So people like to talk about toxic this and carcinogenic that. And a lot of the chemicals have those properties, or historically they've had those properties. But there's also things like, can they burn you? Can they cause skin irritation? Things that are important for workers. But then also, one part of the conversation which often gets missed out are harmless chemicals that are very harmful for the environment. So things like starch that is used in weaving, salt that is used in dyeing, these are things that we eat on a daily basis. But if they go into a river, they can cause enormous damage.
Right.
So the thing that we always have to keep on the agenda is the fact that harmless chemicals can be very, very harmful, and not just talk about toxics and carcinogens.
And they can be harmful because in vast amounts they become problematic.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So when you hear textile dyers saying we're doing dyeing without salt,
Yep.
right? Or we're doing a new denim process that doesn't need starch, or the starch is more
For weaving,
For
yeah.
weaving, exactly.
Right.
Okay.
And the starch, as a matter of fact, is sort of food for the wastewater treatment plant. So done correctly, starch isn't a problem. But if you discharge too much of it, what it does is it depletes the oxygen in the river. So it is a little bit subtle, the sorts of impacts that some of these chemicals can have on the ecosystem, which can be different than the impacts that they have on human health.
Okay.
And that's a key part that Linda mentioned there, effluent treatment plants.
Yeah.
There is part of the industry that has effluent treatment plants, and there's part of the industry that discharges directly to rivers, lakes, etc. And then the part of the industry that's got effluent treatment plants, some of them run them very well and remediate effluent really well,
Yeah.
and some don't.
Okay.
I guess one thing that I would add to that is just that you have to really look at where manufacturing occurs around the world nowadays. So back in the day, let's say 1980s, even into the early 1990s, a lot of the effluent treatment plants were, and manufacturing was occurring in Western Europe or in America, where there was a very mature environmental regulatory system. Everyone had permits, they pretty much knew what they had to do in order to stay on the right side of the law. But as globalization occurred and as some of these manufacturing facilities went abroad, they've wound up in places where the governments lack either the technological capacity or political will to really keep on top of them. And so we have a little bit of a perfect storm there, an industry that uses a lot of chemicals, that discharges a lot of the chemicals that they use in places that aren't really ready for prime time. And that is, I think, a thumbnail sketch of why the industry is so dangerous to human health and the environment, is because some of the areas that they're located in can't really keep on top of curtailing the inherent hazard of the chemicals that they use.
So then, we can see why maybe the problems are there, why they're not being addressed. But how big is this problem? How serious is this problem when it comes on a scale of 1 to 10? 1 being not the problem, 10 being a big problem.
Well, I think you've got three aspects with chemicals. You've got worker safety,
Okay.
you've got consumer safety, and then you've got environment. And with the environment, it's not just a few trees and a few fish, it is the people that live in the environment. And what you have is, overall, the management of these toxic chemicals and carcinogens and nasty chemicals, that's improving. That is definitely an improving picture. The remediation of textile effluents with conventional parameters, so that you're not putting water in there, the sort of effluent in there that depletes oxygen or affects the temperature, affects the levels of solids and salts, etc. That's slowly improving, but it's still nowhere near as good as it was in the 1980s when the industry was largely based in Europe. And
So you're
North
talking
America.
about where it's based now, it's getting better, but it's still quite bad in relation to where it was in Europe.
Yeah, and that's, it's frustrating to someone like me who is an environmental professional that that a lot of these brands know how to do this, and they know what it's supposed to look like. They themselves personally were overseeing this industry operating at a much more advanced level more than 20 years ago. So it's frustrating to watch modern day manufacturing look like old-fashioned manufacturing that had occurred in my country, in America, before the passage of the Clean Water Act in the 1970s. So it's frustrating that as we move forward with so-called progress, we see sort of a really significant backsliding based on just the countries where the industry has moved.
But the chemical inputs
Yes.
are improving.
The chemical
Yes.
inputs
The
are
chemical inputs are
Yes.
improving.
Right.
So
It's the irony, isn't it?
Yeah. So when you said to start with, are the chemical companies part of the problem?
Yeah.
Yes, they are, because they produce the chemicals that are used. But they're also part of the solution.
Yeah.
And to be fair, the better chemical companies have improved significantly over the last 20 years. But the overall picture, it's one of those things where it's quite frightening, really, that I can go into a factory in a developing country where things are being produced and go in with my package of information that I learned in the early 90s when I first started work, and be a hero.
Yeah.
Now, can you imagine that in something like telecommunications. It's laughable that known knowledge using existing techniques from the early 90s can make things much better.
Okay, so we're going to come
in
back to that.
2019.
We're going to come back to that.
It's a crazy situation.
So I want to talk a little bit more about the impacts of harmful chemicals. If we've moved a lot of the production to countries who don't have the infrastructure or the technology or the political motivation and regulation to manage this well, as we did, as you say, many years ago in Europe, does that mean that the environmental impacts, the consumer impacts, the workers' impacts are mainly localized in that part of the world where they're not managing it well? Or does everyone who experiences and buys textiles experience the problem?
Well, the pollution tends to be localized.
Oh.
So if effluents are not remediated and they either go directly into a river or are not properly remediated and go into a river, the pollution effects are localized. But you know, these things are interlinked, and part of the technology and part of the move forward is using energy and water efficiently. So again, the water consumption in the UK in 1990 was more efficient than the water use currently in developing nations where things are being produced. And the more water you use, the more chemicals you use, because it's normally on a gram per litre basis. The more water you use, the more energy you need to heat it up. So it contributes to climate change. So the amount of energy used to heat up these huge amounts of water, so it does affect people.
So I was going to ask, right, I was going to ask the link between chemical use, water, and energy.
Yeah.
Those have always been talked about as sort of a three-part group.
Yeah, but water's the key.
Water's the key.
Yeah.
Right. And then Phil's point that the water tends to be really hot.
Right.
And so that just means you're spending a lot of energy to heat it up. And just to double up on the point that he made, the less water you use, the less chemicals you use, the less energy you use. So the solutions can have a nice harmonic convergence there. You don't have to go, one is not pulling against the other. The only other point I'll make is I fully agree with Phil that the problems are largely local in terms of the impact, with the exception of pollutants that bioaccumulate. And so a pollutant that is persistent, that winds up in the food chain, that winds up in the fish, well, we have a global supply chain of fish. Our food supply is quite global. You look at, I did a lot of work on mercury for a long time, which is not really a hugely important chemical in the apparel sector, though there are some uses. But, the mercury winds up in tuna fish, and all the tuna fish that we eat in America comes from the South China Sea. So some of it is a surprise in terms of impact, but most of it is, as Phil described, localized impacts, with that exception.
And we're not experiencing, I don't see a lot of news articles about chemicals washing off and irritating people's skin.
Right, mostly if it's off spec,
Right.
then you would get that
I
problem.
would get that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't think we can be complacent.
Okay.
And if you look on, for example, the RAPEX system, which is the European system where you get a weekly list of products that have been taken off the market for whatever reason. This could be cars, it can be electrical items. You can't be complacent. There are still textiles out there with harmful levels of dangerous or illegal chemicals present. But it's getting better. And what I would really summarise it as, the chemical inputs are getting better, but we can't be complacent. But the volumes we're consuming, the amounts of water we're using, the amounts of energy we're using to make them, means that as consumers, we've probably never been safer. As citizens, we've probably never been so unsafe. But people don't see that yet. They see a few more storms, they see a few more dry periods.
Okay. So in the big picture, we've been undermining the